Hey, this is Warren Redlick. I didn't have a chance to do a live stream this week. I've been traveling. I'm actually going to be traveling again in about 12 hours. Traveling in Asia, currently in Southeast Asia. I'm in Singapore. I spent a day in Malaysia yesterday, a city called Johor Bahru and the surroundings. Great experience. I'm really enjoying Southeast Asia. I'm really impressed, number one, even in Japan, with the vibrancy, the activity that I see in cities in Asia. I see it in Japan around primarily around the major train stations in the major cities. I think it's less so when you get out to small towns in Japan. The population decline, the fact that young people go to the cities and you've got older people in rural areas. The it definitely seems less active when I was in smaller areas. But just going to Johor Bahru, which is a big city, being in Singapore, which is a big city slash state slash country, um, lots of activity, lots of people. I would say it seems like people. I don't know if this makes sense. They seem to have a more of a sense of purpose. I maybe it's because I lived in America too long, and maybe I'm just seeing a different aspect of America. But I feel like there's a certain malaise in America. There's a certain lack of commitment. There's certainly are people in America who are working hard, who are motivated. But I think on the whole, I see it more in Japan. Only briefly in Singapore and Malaysia. I feel like I see it. I was a little surprised. I guess I expected Malaysia to be poorer than it is. It's poor as I expected. I'm certainly a lot of people driving around the equivalent of a Toyota Corolla or a Nissan Sentra, and saw some nicer cars. A lot of activity downtown. I went to a university. I'm looking for mechanical engineers. Uh, Seeing what mechanical engineering programs are like, I was kind of impressed with what I saw there. I don't think Malaysia is going to work for me long term on a personal level. That's a whole other conversation. But I just wanted to talk about one little aspect that hit me on my time in Malaysia because I'm thinking about a future Robotaxi world. And I have my startup idea for building a pod car which would lower the price of a ride. And I have this impression of what a ride costs based on what I've seen in the US and what I've seen in Japan. In the US, it's about $3 a mile for an Uber ride. In Japan, it's about 300 yen a kilometer, which is about the same as $3 a mile. And in Malaysia, I paid 35 cents a mile, maybe 40 cents a mile for my rides. I did about 20 kilometers for about $5, $6. No, about $4 or $5. It was very, very inexpensive to take Grab. It's not Uber, it's called Grab. Very, very inexpensive rides. Now these were longer distance rides, and I think the rides on average are more expensive per kilometer when you do shorter rides. When we're thinking about a robotaxi future, one of the keys is the thought is that we're lowering the price of a ride because we're lowering the cost of providing the ride. And if we're thinking about $3 a mile in the US, then we can see there's a lot of potential to gain by dropping the price down to $1 a mile or 100 yen a kilometer in Japan. We can see that potential there. But when you're talking about Malaysia, if the price of a ride is already 40 cents a mile, which is dramatically lower than the dollar a mile we're hoping to get to in America, and Kathy Wood thinks we're going to get to 50 cents a mile or even 25 cents a mile, Tasha Keeney, Ark Invest. When I run the numbers on what I see in, let's say, a Tesla Model 3 and maybe what I project for a next generation vehicle, it's hard to get to 25 cents a mile because you have your cost of operating the vehicle and you have to figure that roughly half the miles are what might be called dead miles. That, you start out in the morning and you've got to drive, the vehicle has to drive from where it's parked to where it picks up its first ride. At the end of the day, it has to drive from where it's done its last ride to where it's going to charge. It may have to drive in the middle of the day to charge in the middle of the day. It has to drive from the end of one ride to the beginning of the next ride. And those dead miles, it's roughly estimated they'd have to half the miles. So if your cost of providing the ride is 20 cents a mile, then your real cost of providing the ride is 40 cents a mile. And I roughly did the numbers for what I'm seeing in Southeast Asia, and it's a real struggle to come up with a calculation when you figure the price of gas, the price of maintaining the vehicle, figure the average vehicle is a 10-year-old Toyota Corolla, what's the amortization of the vehicle, what are the insurance costs. It's really hard to get to a point where you have a number where your cost of providing the ride without the driver is less than the price of the ride. So I believe Grab is subsidizing the drivers and losing money, which isn't a good long-term business strategy. But nevertheless, if they charged more, they might not have enough rides because people can't afford the rides unless they're reasonably priced. So there's just a real problem there. Now, if you get to a world where I think we're going to see the next generation vehicle get to the point where its cost of operation is 10 cents a mile or 10 yen a kilometer. And then with the dead miles, that's 20 cents a mile, 20 yen a kilometer. And you can see there you could sell rides for 25 cents a mile or 25 yen a kilometer at a small profit if you did it that way. And certainly you could make money at 50 cents a mile or 50 yen a kilometer. But it's not as straightforward. What's the cost of electricity in some countries? So the cost of gasoline in Malaysia is actually fairly low, lower than America. How are they working that out? Maybe they're just taxing it less. The cost of maintaining a vehicle is lower in Malaysia because the labor cost is lower and they may be able to get their parts for less. A lot of things seem to cost less in Asia, Japan as well. Things just cost less. The typical minimum wage in Japan is around 1,000 yen an hour, which is like $7 to $6.50 an hour. And there's a lot of people working for that. And rents are lower. A lot of things cost less. But still, when you bring that electric vehicle over to Southeast Asia, is the electricity cost going to be lower? And how are they getting electricity costs lower? And ultimately, they were probably using the same fuel, and the fuel cost is global. So I don't see how you get there. I just see a challenge there. And I feel stronger than ever about the podcar startup that one of the essential things that's necessary to deliver self-driving cars, robotaxi rides to the masses, to a much larger share of the population. So we're getting people out of cars, we're getting people out of stinky diesel buses, and we're delivering rides and making their lives better, delivering them more convenient, more efficient, safer, lower cost, more convenient rides. Can we deliver that to the world and make transportation better for everyone, which increases the efficiency of the simulation if you go with Elon's way of putting it. But I do think that when we think about the future of robotaxi, it's one thing to talk about it in the United States and Europe and wealthy countries like Japan and to some extent China and a few other countries that are relatively wealthy. Singapore is a small country, but same idea. Canada, Australia, you can see. But there's a really big chunk of the world that doesn't have as much money as the rest of us. And you really have to drive the price of that ride down. Now, maybe to some extent the price of the ride in those other countries also goes down. Another good example is the cost of insurance in Malaysia is much lower than America. They don't really have the personal injury liability system. The cost of repair is lower for a variety of reasons. Their insurance costs are apparently lower as well. So this is just an initial thought, like how is this going to work out? What's the future of the Tesla Robotaxi network? We can see that future in America. We can see it in Europe. We can see it in Japan. I think largely we can see it in China, some other wealthy countries, but spreading around the world, expanding the Tesla Robotaxi network to cover more and more people, and expanding the number of vehicles in the fleet and the amount of revenue that's generated. And if you're bringing the price down, the gross profit per vehicle is lower. So all those things come together. And I think this is one of the things where we have to think more carefully what's the future of the Tesla Robotaxi network? What's the revenue generation? I think there's enough demand in the United States, Europe, Japan, Canada, Australia, wealthier parts of China, Singapore, other places in the world that have money, the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, that I think we can see it delivering those rides and generating a massive amount of profit. But as you expand the robotaxi network to cover more of the world, I think you're going to see the price come down in a lot of places, and the gain is going to be less. So there's the upside of the robotaxi network may be a little lower than I thought, and the value generation of bot, if you think about it, at a $20 an hour, that's great for America, but the minimum wage in Japan is less than half of that. And then you get to Malaysia where it's much less than that. So the value generation of bot is really going to vary depending on where you're running it. So these are all things to think about. I think I'm going to try to piece this together again into a different model in the future at some point. And really, I'm getting ready for a trip. I'm excited about the future. I hope you're all excited about the future. So many good things happening. Cybertruck is coming. So thanks everybody so much for watching. Please let me know what you think in the comments below. Please support me on the Locals platform, on Patreon, as a YouTube channel member, or most important of all, as a Twitter subscriber or an X subscriber. Check out my other videos, and thank you so much for watching.